Welcome, friends. Welcome to the campfire. Come on in. Find a place around the campfire to sit down. There's some logs over there to sit on. There's some rocks. There's some chairs strewn around. Get some coffee or get you something to drink over there and sit down next to a friend. And let's tell some stories. Now, that's what we do around the campfire. Tonight, I want to read you a story by Jack London. You know, it's an outdoor type of story, and that's sort of what we're known for. It's called The Scarlet Plague. I don't know how many of you have read it. I've never seen it before, so it's going to be interesting. Let's start with chapter 1. The way led along upon what had once been the embankment of a railroad, but no train had run upon it for many years. The forest on either side swelled up the slopes of the embankment and crested across it in a green wave of trees and bushes. The trail was as narrow as a man's body and was no more than a wild animal runway. Occasionally, a piece of rusty iron, showing through the forest mold, advertised that the rail and the ties still remained. And in one place, a 10-inch tree, bursting through a connection, had lifted the end of a rail cleanly into view. The tie had evidently followed the rail, held to it by the spike, long enough for its bed to be filled with gravel and rotten leaves, so that now the crumbling rotten timber thrust itself at a curious slant. Now, old as this road was, it was manifest that it had been of the monorail type. An old man and a boy traveled along this runway. They moved slowly, for the old man was very old. A touch of palsy made his movements tremulous. He leaned heavily upon his staff. A rude skullcap of goatskin protected his head from the sun, and from beneath this fell a scant fringe of stained and dirty white hair. A visor, ingeniously made from a large leaf, shielded his eyes, and from under this he peered at the way of his feet on the trail. His beard, which should have been snow white, but which showed the same weather wear and camp stain as his hair, fell nearly to his waist in a great tangled mass. About his chest and shoulders hung a single mangy garment of goat skin. His arms and his legs, withered and skinny, betokened extreme age, as well as did their sunburn and scars and scratches betoken long years of exposure to the elements. The boy, who led the way, checking the eagerness of his muscles to the slow progress of the elder, likewise wore a single garment, just a ragged-edged piece of bearskin with a hole in the middle through which he thrust his head. He could not have been more than 12 years old. Tucked coquettishly over one ear was the freshly severed tail of a pig. In one hand he carried a medium-sized bow and an arrow. On his back was a quiver full of arrows, and from a sheath hanging around his neck on a thong projected the battered handle of a hunting knife. He was as brown as a berry and walked softly, with almost a cat-like tread. In marked contrast with his sunburned skin were his eyes. They were blue, deep blue, but keen and sharp as a pair of gimlets. They seemed to bore into aft about him in a way that was habitual, and as he went along he smelled things as well, his distended, quivering nostrils carrying to his brain an endless series of messages from the outside world. Also, his hearing was acute, and had been so trained that it operated automatically, without conscious effort. He heard all the slight sounds in an apparent quiet, heard, and differentiated and classified these sounds, whether they were of the wind rustling the leaves, the humming of bees or gnats, of the distant rumble of the sea that drifted to him only in lulls, or of the gopher just under his foot shoving a pouch full of earth into the entrance of his hole. Suddenly, he became alertly tense. Sound, sight, and odor had given him a simultaneous warning. His hand went back to the old man, touching him, and the pair stood still. Ahead, at one side of the top of the embankment, arose a crackling sound. and the boy's gaze was fixed on the tops of the agitated bushes. Then a large bear, a grizzly, crashed into view, and likewise stopped abruptly at the sight of the humans. He did not like them, and growled querulously. Slowly, the boy fitted the arrow to the bow, and slowly he pulled the bowstring taut. But he never removed his eyes from the bear. The old man peered from under his green leaf at the danger, and stood just as quietly as the boy. For a few seconds this mutual scrutinizing went on. Then, the bear betraying a growing irritability, the boy, with a movement of his head, indicated that the old man must step aside from the trail and go down the embankment. The boy followed, going backward, still holding the bow taut and ready. They waited till a crashing among the bushes from the opposite side of the embankment told them that the bear had gone on. The boy grinned as he led back to the trail. "A big 'un, Granzer," he chuckled. The old man shook his head. "They get thicker every day," he complained in a thin, undependable falsetto. "Who'd have thought I'd live to see the time when a man would be afraid of his life on the way to a cliff house? When I was a boy, Edwin, men and women and little babies used to come out here from San Francisco by tens of thousands on a nice day. And there weren't any bears then. No, sir. They used to pay money to look at them in cages. They were that rare." "What is money, Granzer?" And before the old man could answer, the boy recollected and triumphantly shoved his hand into a pouch under his bearskin and pulled forth a battered and tarnished silver dollar. The old man's eyes glistened as he held the coin close to them. "I can't see," he muttered. "You look and see if you can make out the date, Edwin." The boy laughed. "You're a great Granzer," he cried delightedly. "Always making believe them little marks mean something." The old man manifested an accustomed chagrin as he brought the coin back in again close to his own eyes. 2012, he shrilled, and then fell to cackling grotesquely. "That was the year Morgan the Fifth was appointed President of the United States by the Board of Magnates. It must have been one of the last coins minted, for the Scarlet Death came in 2013. Lord, think of it. 60 years ago, and I am the only person alive today that lived in those times. Where did you find it, Edwin?" The boy, who had been regarding him with the tolerant curiousness one accords to the prattlings of the feeble-minded, answered promptly. "I got it off of Hoo-Hoo. He found it when we was herding goats down near San Jose last spring. Hoo-Hoo said it was money. Well, ain't you hungry, Granzer?" The ancient caught his staff in a tighter grip and urged along the trail, his old eyes shining greedily. "I hope Hare-Lip's found a crab or two," he mumbled. "They're good eating, crabs, mighty good eating when you've got no more teeth and you've got grandsons that love their old grandsire and make a point of catching crabs for him. Why, when I was a boy—" But Edwin, suddenly stopped by what he saw, was drawing the bowstring on a fitted arrow. He had paused on the brink of a crevasse in the embankment. An ancient culvert had here washed out, and the stream, no longer confined, had cut a passage through the fill material. On the opposite side, the end of a rail projected and overhung. It showed rustily through the creeping vines which overran it, and just beyond, crouching by a bush, a rabbit looked across at him in trembling hesitancy. Fully 50 feet was the distance, but that arrow flashed true, and the transfixed rabbit, crying out in sudden fright and hurt, struggling painfully away into the bush. The boy himself was a flash of brown skin and flying fur as he bounced down the steep wall of the gap up the other side. His lean muscles were springs of steel that released into graceful and efficient action. 100 feet beyond, in a tangle of bushes, he overtook that wounded creature, knocked its head on a convenient tree trunk, and turned it over to Granzer to carry. Rabbit is good, very good, the ancient quavered. But when it comes to a toothsome delicacy, why, I prefer crab. When I was a boy... Why do you say so much that ain't got no sense? Edwin impatiently interrupted. The others threatened garrulousness. The boy did not exactly utter these words, but something that remotely resembled them, and that was more guttural and explosive and economical of qualifying phrases. You see, his speech showed distant kinship with that of the old man, and the latter's speech was approximately in English that had gone through a bath of corrupt usage. What I want to know, Edwin continued, is why you call crab a toothsome delicacy. Crab is crab, ain't it? No one I ever heard calls it such funny things. The old man sighed, but he didn't answer. They moved on in silence. The surf grew suddenly louder as they emerged from the forest upon a stretch of sand dunes bordering the sea. A few goats were browsing among the sandy hillocks, and a skin-clad boy, aided by a wolfish-looking dog that was only faintly reminiscent of a collie, was watching them. Mingled with the roar of the surf was a continuous, deep-throated barking, or bellowing, which came from a cluster of jagged rocks 100 yards out from shore. Here it was that huge sea lions hauled themselves up to lie in the sun or battle with one another. In the immediate foreground arose the smoke of a fire, tended by a third savage-looking boy, and crouched near him were several other wolfish dogs, similar to the one that guarded the goats. The old man accelerated his pace, sniffing eagerly as he neared the fire. "Mussels," he muttered ecstatically. "Mussels! And ain't that a crab? Hoo-hoo, ain't that a crab? My, you boys are good to your old grandsire." Hoo-hoo, who was apparently the same age as Edwin, grinned. "All you want, Granzer. I got 4. The old man's palsied eagerness was pitiful. Sitting down in the sand as quickly as his stiff limbs would let him, he poked a large rock mussel from out of the coals. The heat had forced its shells apart, and the meat, salmon-colored, was thoroughly cooked. Between thumb and forefinger, in trembling haste, he caught that morsel and carried it to his mouth. But it was too hot, and the next moment was violently ejected. The old man spluttered with pain. Tears ran out of his eyes and down his cheeks. The boys were true savages, possessing only the cruel humor of the savage. To them, the incident was excruciatingly funny, and they burst into loud laughter. Hoo-hoo danced up and down, while Edwin rolled gleefully on the ground. The boy with the goats came running down to join in the fun. "Set 'em to cool, Edwin, set 'em to cool," the old man besought, in the midst of his grief, making no attempt to wipe away the tears that still flowed from his eyes. "And cool a crab, Edwin, too. You know your grandsire likes crabs." From the coals arose a great sizzling, which proceeded from the many mussels bursting open their shells and exuding their moisture. There were very large shellfish, running from 3 to 6 inches in length. The boys raked them out with sticks and placed them on a large piece of driftwood to cool off. Well, when I was a boy, we did not laugh at our elders. We respected them. The boys took no notice, and Granzer continued to babble an incoherent flow of complaint and censure. But this time he was more careful, and did not burn his mouth. All began to eat, using nothing but their hands and making loud mouth noises and lip smackings. The third boy, who was called Hare-Lip, slyly deposited a pinch of sand on a mussel the ancient was carrying to his mouth. And when that grit of it bit into the old feller's mucous membrane and gums, the laughter was again uproarious. He was unaware that a joke had been played on him, and spluttered and spat until Edwin, relenting, gave him a gourd of fresh water with which to wash out his mouth. "Where's them crabs, Hoo-hoo?" Edwin demanded. "Granzer's set upon having a snack." Again, Granzer's eyes burned with greediness as a large crab was handed to him. It was a shell with legs and all complete, but the meat had long since departed. With shaky fingers and babblings of anticipation, the old man broke off a leg and found it filled with emptiness. "The crabs!" Hoo-hoo, he wailed. "The crabs! I was foolin', Granzer. They ain't no crabs. I never found one." The boys were overwhelmed with delight at sight of the tears of senile disappointment that dribbled down the old man's cheeks. Then, unnoticed, Hoo-hoo replaced the empty shell with a fresh cooked crab. Already dismembered, from the cracked legs the white meat sent forth a small cloud of savory steam. This attracted the old man's nostrils, and he looked down in amazement. The change of his mood to one of joy was immediate. He snuffled and muttered and mumbled, making almost a croon of delight as he began to eat. Of this the boys took little notice, for it was an accustomed spectacle. Nor did they notice his occasional exclamations and utterances of phrases which meant nothing to them, as, for instance, when he smacked his lips and champed his gums while muttering, "Mayonnaise, just think, mayonnaise. And it's 60 years since the last was ever made. 2 generations and never a smell of it. Why, in those days it was served in every restaurant with crab." When he could eat no more, the old man sighed, wiped his hands on his naked legs, and gazed out over the sea. With the content of a full stomach, he waxed reminiscent. "To think of it, I've seen this beach alive with men, women, and children on a pleasant Sunday, and there weren't any bears to eat them up either. And right up there on that cliff was a big restaurant where you could get anything you wanted to eat. 4 million people lived in San Francisco then, and now in the whole city and county there ain't 40 all told. And out there on the sea were ships, and ships always to be seen, going in for the Golden Gate or coming out. And airships in the air, dirigibles and flying machines. Why, they could travel 200 miles an hour. The mail contracts with the New York and San Francisco Limited demanded for that minimum. There was a chap, a Frenchman, I forgot his name, who succeeded in making 300. But the thing was risky. It was too risky for conservative persons. But he was on the right clue, and he would have managed if he hadn't been for the Great Plague. When I was a boy, there were men alive who remembered the coming of the first aeroplanes, and now I have lived to see the last of them. And that 60 years ago." The old man babbled on, unheeded by the boys, who were long accustomed to his garrulousness, and whose vocabularies, besides, lacked the greater portion of the words that he used. It was noticeable that in these rambling soliloquies his English seemed to recrudesce into better construction and phraseology. But when he talked directly with the boys, it lapsed largely into their own uncouth and simpler forms. "But there weren't many crabs in those days," the old man wandered on. "They were fished out, and they were great delicacies. The open season was only a month long, too, and now crabs are accessible the whole year round. Think of it. Catching all the crabs you want, any time you want, in the surf of the Cliff House Beach." A sudden commotion among the goats brought the boys to their feet. The dogs about the fire rushed to join their snarling fellow who guarded the goats, while the goats themselves stampeded in the direction of their human protectors. A half-dozen forms, lean and gray, glided about on the sand hillocks and faced the bristling dogs. Edwin arched an arrow that fell short, but Hare-Lip, with a sling such as David carried into battle against Goliath, hurled a stone through the air that whistled from the speed of its flight. It fell squarely among the wolves and caused them to slink away towards the dark depth of the eucalyptus forest. The boys laughed and lay down again in the sand, while Granzer sighed ponderously. He had eaten too much, and with hands clasped on his paunch, fingers interlaced, he resumed his maunderings. "The fleeting systems lapse like foam," he mumbled, what was evidently a quotation. "That's it, foam and fleeting. All man's toil upon the planet was just so much foam. He domesticated the serviceable animals, destroyed the hostile ones, and cleared the land of its wild vegetation. And then he passed, and the flood of primordial life rolled back again, sweeping his handiwork away. The weeds and the forest inundated his fields. The beasts of prey swept over his flocks. And now there were wolves on the Cliff House beach. He was appalled by the thought. Where 4 million people disported themselves, the wild wolves roam today, and the savage progeny of our loins with prehistoric weapons defend themselves against the fanged despoilers. Think of it, and all because of the Scarlet Death. The adjective had caught Hare-Lip's ear. He's always saying that, he said to Edwin. What is scarlet? The scarlet of the maples can shake me like the cry of bugles going by, the old man quoted. It's red, Edwin answered the question. And you don't know it because you come from the chauffeur tribe. They never did know nothing, none of them. Scarlet is red, and I know that. Well, red is red, ain't it? Hare-Lip grumbled. And then what's the good of getting cocky and calling it scarlet? Granzer, what for do you always say so much what nobody knows, he asked. Scarlet ain't anything, but red is red. Why don't you just say red then? Well, red is not the right word, was the reply. The plague was scarlet. The whole face and the body turned scarlet in an hour's time. Don't I know? Didn't I see enough of it? And I am telling you it was scarlet because it was scarlet. There was no other word for it. Well, red is good enough for me, Hare-Lip muttered obstinately. My dad calls red, red, and he ought to know. He says everybody died of the Red Death. Your dad is a common fella, descended from a common fellow, Granzer retorted heatedly. Don't I know the beginning of the chauffeurs? Your grandsire was a chauffeur, a servant, and without education. He worked for other persons. But your grandmother was of good stock. Only the children did not take after her. Don't I remember when I first met them, catching fish at Lake Temescal? What is education? Edwin asked. Calling red scarlet, Hare-Lip sneered, then returned to the attack on Granzer. Well, my dad told me, and he got it from his dad afore he croaked, that your wife was a Santa Rosan and that she was sure no account. He said she was a hash slinger before the Red Death, though I don't know what a hash slinger is. You can tell me, Edwin. But Edwin shook his head in token of ignorance. It is true. She was a waitress, Granzer acknowledged, but she was a good woman, and your mother was her daughter. Women were very scarce in the days after the plague. She was the only wife I could find, even if she was a hash slinger, as your father calls it. But it's not nice to talk about our progenitors in that way. Dad says that the wife of the first chauffeur was a lady. What's a lady? Hoo-Hoo demanded. A lady's a chauffeur's squaw, was a quick reply from Hare-Lip. The first chauffeur was Bill, a common fella, as I said before, the old man expounded, but his wife was a lady, a great lady, and before the Scarlet Death, she was the wife of Van Worden. He was the president of the board of industrial magnates and was one of the dozen men who rolled America. He was worth $1,800,000,000, coins like you have there in your pouch, Edwin. And then came the Scarlet Death, and his wife became the wife of Bill, the first chauffeur. He used to beat her, too. I've seen it myself. Hoo-Hoo, lying on his stomach and idly digging his toes in the sand, cried out and investigated. First his toenail, and next the small hole he had dug. The other two boys joined him, excavating the sand rapidly with their hands, till there lay 3 skeletons exposed. Two were of adults, and the third being that of a part-grown child. The old man trudged along on the ground and peered at the find. Plague victims, he announced. That's the way they died everywhere in the last days. There must have been a family running away from the contagion and perishing here on the Cliff House beach. What are you doing, Edwin? The question was asked in sudden dismay as Edwin, using the back of his hunting knife, began to knock the teeth from the jaws of one of the skulls. Gonna string 'em, was the response. The 3 boys were now hard at it, and quite a knocking and a hammering arose, in which Granzer babbled on unnoticed. You are true savages. Already has begun the custom of wearing human teeth, In another generation, you'll be perforating your noses and ears and wearing ornaments of bones and shells. I know. The human race is doomed to sink back further and further into the primitive night, ere again it begins its bloody climb upward to civilization. When we increase and feel the lack of room, we will proceed to kill one another. And then I suppose you'll wear human scalp locks at your waist as well. As you, Edwin, you are the gentlest of my grandsons, have already begun with that vile pigtail. Throw it away, Edwin boy, throw it away. What a gabble the old geezer makes, Hare-Lip remarked. When, the teeth all extracted, they begin an attempt at equal division. They are very quick and abrupt in their actions and their speech. In moments of hot discussion over the allotment of the choicer teeth was truly a gabble. They spoke in monosyllables and short, jerky sentences. It was more a gibberish than a language. And yet, through it ran hints of grammatical construction and appeared vestiges of the conjugation of some superior culture. Even the speech at Granzer was so corrupt that were it put down literally, it would be almost so much nonsense to the reader. This, however, was when he talked with the boys. When he got into the full swing of babbling to himself, it slowly purged itself into pure English. The sentences grew longer and were enunciated with a rhythm and ease that was reminiscent of the lecture platform. "Tell us about the Red Death, Granzer," Hare-Lip demanded, when the teeth affair had been satisfactorily concluded. "The Scarlet Death," Edwin corrected. "And don't work all that funny lingo on us," Hare-Lip went on. "Talk sensible, Granzer, like a Santa Rosan ought to talk. Other Santa Rosans don't talk like you." Chapter 2. The old man showed pleasure in being thus called upon. He cleared his throat and began. 20 or 30 years ago, my story was in great demand, but in those days nobody seemed interested. "There you go," Hare-Lip cried hotly. "Cut out the funny stuff and talk sensible. What's interested? You talk like a baby that don't know how." "Let him alone," Edwin urged, "or he'll get mad and won't talk at all. Skip the funny places. We'll catch on to some of what he tells us." "Let her go, Granzer," Hoo-Hoo encouraged, for the old man was already maundering about the disrespect for elders and the reversion to cruelty of all humans that fell from high culture back down to primitive conditions. The tale began. There were very many people in the world in those days. San Francisco alone held 4 millions. "What is millions?" Edwin interrupted. Granzer looked at him kindly. "I know you cannot count beyond 10, so I'm going to tell you. Hold up your 2 hands. On both of them you have altogether 10 fingers and thumbs. Very well. Now I take this grain of sand. You hold it, Hoo-Hoo." He dropped the grain of sand into the lad's palm and went on. "Now that grain of sand stands for the 10 fingers of Edwin. Now I add another grain. That's 10 more fingers. And then I add another, and another, and another, till I've added as many grains as Edwin has fingers and thumbs. That makes what I call 100. Now remember that word, 100. Now I put this pebble in Hare-Lip's hands. It stands for 10 grains of sand, or 10 tens of fingers, or 100 fingers. I put in 10 pebbles. They stand for 1,000 fingers. I take the mussel shell, and it stands for 10 pebbles, or 100 grains of sand, or 1,000 fingers, and so on. Laboriously, and with much reiteration, he strove to build up in their minds a crude conception of numbers. As the quantities increased, he had the boys holding different magnitudes in each of their hands. For still higher sums, he laid the symbol on the log of driftwood. And for symbols, he was hard put, being compelled to use the teeth from the skull for millions and the crab shell for billions. It was here that he stopped, for the boys were showing signs of becoming tired. There were 4 million people in San Francisco. 4 teeth. The boys' eyes ranged along the teeth and from hand to hand, down through the pebbles and the sand grains to Edwin's fingers, and back again they ranged along with the sending series in the effort to grasp such inconceivable numbers. "Well, that was a lot of folks, Granzer," Edwin at last hazarded. Like sand on the beach here, like sand on the beach. Each grain of sand, a man or a woman or a child. Yes, my boy, all those people lived right here in San Francisco. And at one time or another, all those people came out on this very beach. More people than there are grains of sand. More, more, more. And San Francisco was a noble city. And across the bay, where we camped last year, even more people lived. Clear from Point Richmond on the level ground and on the hills, all the way around to San Leandro. One great city of 7 million people. That's 7 teeth. And there, that's it. 7 millions. Again, the boy's eyes ranged up and down from Edwin's fingers to the teeth on the log. The world was full of people. The census of 2010 gave 8 billions for the whole world. 8 crab shells, yes, 8 billions. It was not like today. Mankind knew a great deal more about getting food. And the more food there was, the more people there were. Now, in the year 1800, there were 170 million in Europe alone. 100 years later, a grain of sand, 100 years later, at 1900, there were 500 million in Europe. 5 grains of sand. And this one tooth. This shows how easy was the getting of food, and how men increased. And in the year 2000, there were 1,500 millions in Europe. And it was the same all over the rest of the world. 8 crab shells there, yes, 8 billion people were alive on the earth when the Scarlet Death began. I was a young man when the plague came, 27 years old, and I lived on the other side of the San Francisco Bay, in Berkeley. You remember those great stone houses, Edwin, when we came down the hills from Contra Costa? That was where I lived, in those stone houses. I was a professor of English literature. Much of this was over the head of the boys, but they strove to comprehend dimly the tale of the past. "What was them stone houses for?" Hare-Lip queried. "You remember when your dad taught you to swim?" The boy nodded. "Well, in the University of California, that is the name we had for the houses, we taught young men and young women how to think, just as I have taught you now, by sand and pebbles and shells, to know how many people lived in those days. There was very much to teach. The young men and women we taught were called students. And we had large rooms in which we taught them. I talked to them, 40 or 50 at a time, just as I'm talking to you right now. I told them about the books other men had written before their time, and even sometimes in their time." "Was that all you did? Just talk, talk, talk?" Hoo-hoo demanded. "Who hunted your meat for you, and milked the goats, and caught the fish?" "A sensible question, Hoo-hoo, a sensible question. Now, if I have told you, in those days food getting was easy. We were very wise. A few men got the food for many men. The other men, they did other things. As you say, I talked all the time, for this food was given me. Much food, fine food, beautiful food. Food that I have not tasted in 60 years, and shall never taste again. I sometimes think the most wonderful achievement of our tremendous civilization was food. Its unconceivable abundance, its infinite variety, its marvelous delicacy. Oh, my grandsons, life was life in those days. We had so much wonderful things to eat." This was beyond the boys, and they let it slip by, words and thoughts, as a mere senile wandering in the narratives. "Our food-getters were called freemen." This was a joke. We of all the ruling classes owned all the land, all the machines, everything. These food-getters were our slaves. We took almost all the food they got and left them a little so that they might eat and work and get us more food. "I'd have gone into the forest and got food for myself," Hare-Lip announced, "and if any man tried to take it from me, I'd have killed him." The old man laughed. "Did I not tell you that we were of the ruling class, owned all the land, all the forest, everything? Any food-getter who would not get food for us, well, him we punished or compelled to starve to death, and very few did that. They preferred to get food for us and make clothes for us and prepare and administer to us a mussel shell, 1,000 satisfactions and delights. And I was Professor Smith in those days. Professor James Howard Smith. And my lecture courses were very popular. That is, very many of the young men and women liked to hear me talk about the books other men had written. And I was very happy, and I had beautiful things to eat. My hands were soft, because I do no work with them, and my body was clean all over and dressed in the softest garments. He surveyed his mangy goatskin with disgust. We did not wear such things in those days. Even the slaves had better garments, and we were most clean. We washed our faces and our hands often every day. You boys never wash unless you fall into the water or go swimming. Well, neither do you, Granzer, Hoo-Hoo retorted. Well, I know, I'm a filthy old man, but times have changed. Nobody washes these days. There are no conveniences. It is 60 years since I have seen a piece of soap. You do not know what soap is, and I shall not tell you, for I am telling the story of the Scarlet Death. You know what sickness is. We called it a disease. Very many of the diseases came from what we called germs. Remember that word, germs. A germ is a very small thing. It is like a wood tick, such as you find on the dogs in the spring of the year when they run in the forest. Only the germ is very small. It is so small that you cannot see it. Now Hoo-Hoo began to laugh at that. You're a queer one, Granzer, talking about things you can't see. If you can't see them, how do you know they are? That's what I want to know. How do you know anything you can't see? A good question. A very good question, Hoo-Hoo, but we did see some of them. We had what we called microscopes and ultramicroscopes. We put them to our eyes and we looked through them so that we saw things larger than they really were. And many things we could not see without the microscopes at all. Our best ultramicroscopes could make a germ look 40,000 times larger. A mussel shell is 1,000 fingers like Edwin's. Take 40 mussel shells, and by as many times larger was the germ when we looked at it through a microscope. And after that, we had other ways, by using what we called moving pictures, of making the 40,000 time germ many, many thousand times larger still. And thus we saw all these things which our eyes of themselves could not see. Take a grain of sand, break it into 10 pieces. Take one piece and break it into 10, and break one of those pieces into 10, and one of those into 10, and one of those into 10, and one of those into 10. Do it all day, and maybe by sunset you will have a piece as small as one of the germs. The boys were openly incredulous. Hare-Lip sniffed and sneered, and Hoo-Hoo snickered, until Edwin nudged him to be silent. The wood tick sucks the blood of the dog, but the germ, being so very small, goes right into the blood of the body, and there it has many children. And in those days there would be as many as 1 billion, crab shell please, as many as that crab shell in one man's body. Now we call germs microorganisms. When a few million or 1 billion of them were in a man, in all the blood of a man, he was sick. And these germs were a disease. There were many different kinds of them, more different kinds than there are grains of sand on this beach. We knew only a few of the kinds. The microorganic world was an invisible world, a world we couldn't see, and so we knew very little about it. Yet we did know something. There was this Bacillus anthracus, there was the Micrococcus, and there was the Bacterium termo, and the Bacterium lactis, and that's what turns the goat milk sour even to this day. Hare-Lip, and there were schizionates without end, and there were many others. Here the old man launched into a disquisition on germs and their natures, using words and phrases of such extraordinary length and meaninglessness that the boys grinned at one another and looked out over the deserted ocean till they forgot the old man was babbling on. But the Scarlet Death, Granzer, Edwin at last suggested. Granzer recollected himself and with a start tore himself away from the rostrum of the lecture hall where, to another world audience, he had been expounding on the latest theory, 60 years gone, of germs and germ disease. Yes, Edwin, I had forgotten. Sometimes the memory of the past is very strong upon me, and I forget that I am a dirty old man, clad in goat skin, wandering with my savage grandsons who were goat herds in the primeval wilderness. The fleeting systems lapse like foam, and so lapsed our glorious, colossal civilization. I am Granzer, a tired old man. I belong to the tribe of Santa Rosans. I married into that tribe. My sons and daughters married into the chauffeurs and the Sacramentos and the Palo Altos. You, Hare-Lip, are of the chauffeurs. You, Edwin, are of the Sacramentos. And you, Hoo-Hoo, are of the Palo Altos. Your tribe takes its name from a town that was near the seat of another great institution of learning. It was called Stanford University. Yes, I remember now. It was perfectly clear. I was telling you of the Scarlet Death. Where was I in my story? Well, you were telling about germs, the things you can't see which make men sick, Edwin prompted. Yeah, that's where I was. A man did not notice at first when only a few of these germs got into his body. But each germ broke in half and became 2 germs, and kept doing this very rapidly so that in a short time there were many millions of them in his body. Then the man was sick. He had a disease, and the disease was named after a kind of a germ that was in him. It might be measles, it might be influenza, it might be yellow fever. It might be any of thousands and thousands of kinds of diseases. Now, this is the strange thing about these germs. There are always new ones coming to live in men's bodies. Long and long and long ago, when there were only a few men in the world, there were few diseases. But as men increased and lived closely together in great cities and civilizations, new diseases arose. New kinds of germs entered their bodies. Thus were countless millions and billions of humans being killed. And the more thickly men packed together, the more terrible were the new diseases that came to be. Long before my time, in the Middle Ages, there was the Black Plague that swept across Europe. It swept across Europe many times. There was tuberculosis that entered into men wherever they were thickly packed. 100 years before my time, there was the bubonic plague. And in Africa was the sleeping sickness. The bacteriologists fought all these sicknesses and destroyed them, just as you boys fight the wolves away from your goats or squash the mosquitoes that light on you. The bacteriologists... But, Granzer, what is a what-you-call-it? Edwin interrupted. Well, you, Edwin, are a goat herd. Your task is to watch the goats. You know a great deal about goats. Well, a bacteriologist watches germs. That's his task. He knows a great deal about them. So as I was saying, the bacteriologists fought with the germs and destroyed them. Sometimes. There was a leprosy, a horrible disease, 100 years before I was born. Well, the bacteriologists discovered the germ of leprosy. They knew all about it. They made pictures of it. I've seen these pictures. But they never found a way to kill it. But in 1984, there was the Pontoblast plague, a disease that broke out in the country called Brazil and that killed millions of people. But the bacteriologists found it out and found the way to kill it so that the Pontoblast plague went no farther. They made what they called a serum, which they put into a man's body and which killed the Pontoblast germs without killing the man. And in 1910, there was the pellagra and also the hookworm. These were easily killed by the bacteriologists. But in 1947, there arose a new disease that had never been seen before. It got into the bodies of babies of only 10 months old or less, and it made them unable to move their hands and their feet, or to eat, or anything. And the bacteriologists were 11 years in discovering how to kill that particular germ and save the babies. In spite of all these diseases, and of all the new ones that continued to arise, there were more and more men in the world. This was because it was easy to get food. The easier it was to get food, the more men there were. And the more men there were, the more thickly they were packed together on the earth. And the more thickly they were packed, the more new kinds of germs became diseases. There were warnings. Soldervetsky, as early as 1929, told the bacteriologists that they had no guarantee against some new disease, 1,000 times more deadly than any they knew, that would arise and kill by the hundreds of millions and even by the billion. You see, the microorganic world remained a mystery to the end. They knew there was such a world, and from time to time, armies of new germs emerged from it to kill men. Well, that was all they knew about it. For all they knew, in that invisible microorganic world, there might be as many different kinds of germs as there are grains of sand on this beach. And also, in that same invisible world, it might well be that some new kinds of germs come to be. It might be there that life originated, the abysmal fecundity, Solvernetsky called it, applying the words of other men who had written before him. It was at this point that Hare-Lip rose to his feet, an expression of huge contempt on his face. "Granzer," he announced, "you make me sick with your gabble. Why don't you tell about the Red Death? And if you ain't going to, say so, and we'll start back for camp." The old man looked at him, silently began to cry. The weak tears of age rolled down his cheeks, and all the feebleness of his 87 years showed in his grief-stricken countenance. "Sit down," Edwin counseled soothingly. "Granzer's all right. He's just getting to the Scarlet Death, ain't you, Granzer? He's just going to tell us about it right now. Sit down, Hare-Lip. You go ahead, Granzer." Well, friends, it's getting a little late, and I'm thinking we all ought to turn in for tonight, or at least I am. You're all welcome to stick around this fire as long as you like. Just don't let her go out if you're going to stay warm from it. These nights are getting colder. Next time I see you here at the fire, I'll tell you some more of the story. In fact, I'll probably tell you the rest of it. It's kind of interesting how it parallels somewhat the world that we've got. Interesting. Well, it's been good talking with you tonight. I'll be glad to see you again next time. And until then, be careful out there. This is Clay Steele. Good night.